The polished marble floor of Worthington's elite equestrian auction house reflected the crystal chandeliers overhead, creating an atmosphere of refined elegance that made every muddy boot print stand out like a scar. On silk, Dalton Riverstone stepped through the grand entrance, his weathered work boots leaving dark impressions on the pristine surface, drawing immediate attention from the assembled crowd of wealthy horse enthusiasts. "Would you look at that?" whispered Cordelia Fairchild, the heiress to a pharmaceutical fortune, her manicured fingers adjusting her diamond-studded riding crop. Someone let the help through the front door. Snickers rippled through the crowd as Dalton made his way toward the viewing area, where the evening's prized possession stood tethered a magnificent thoroughbred stallion, named Thunder's Legacy, whose bloodline traced back to legendary racing champions. The horse's coat gleamed like burnished copper under the auction house lights, and his spirited eyes surveyed the crowd with an intelligence that spoke of generations of careful breeding. Dalton had driven for hours through a thunderstorm to reach this auction, his battered pickup truck contrasting sharply with the fleet of luxury sedans and imported sports cars filling the parking lot. His savings account, carefully built over 20 years of dawn-to-dusk farming, contained exactly enough for the horse's estimated selling price, but he knew the bidding war would likely push far beyond his means. "Excuse me, sir," interrupted Pemberton Ashworth III, the auction house's pristine manager, his voice dripping with condescension. "Are you perhaps looking for the livestock auction that's held at the county fairgrounds?" "Not here." The surrounding crowd erupted in laughter, their amusement sharp and cutting. Dalton's weathered face remained impassive, though his calloused hands tightened slightly at his sides. He'd faced mockery before from city folk who couldn't understand why someone would choose a life of soil and sweat over air-conditioned offices and guaranteed paychecks. "I'm here for the horse," Dalton replied quietly, his voice carrying the steady confidence of a man who'd spent decades earning respect through actions rather than words. Cordelia's laugh tinkled like breaking glass. "Oh, this is rich. The farm boy thinks he can afford Thunder's Legacy. Do you even know what that horse is worth?" "More than your farm's worth, I'd wager," added Maximilian Westbrook, a steel magnate's son whose idea of manual labor was signing checks. "Perhaps you should stick to dairy cows and barnyard chickens." The crowd's laughter grew more boisterous, but Dalton noticed something they missed. Thunder's Legacy had turned his magnificent head toward the commotion, his dark eyes focusing intently on the farmer. The horse's ears pricked forward, and he shifted restlessly, as if responding to something beyond the surface mockery. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the auctioneer, his voice booming across the hall, "we're about to begin bidding on Lot 17, Thunder's Legacy, son of Storm's Promise and grandson of Lightning's Dawn. Opening bid is $50,000. Dalton reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a simple numbered paddle, its plain white surface stark against the elaborate gold-leafed paddles held by the other bidders. The gesture sent another wave of amusement through the crowd, but the farmer's attention remained fixed on the horse, who continued to watch him with growing interest. The bidding began with the swift efficiency of a well-oiled machine, numbers climbing rapidly as the wealthy elite competed for their prize. But something unexpected was about to unfold, something that would transform their cruel amusement into stunned silence. The bidding escalated with ruthless efficiency, each raise of a paddle accompanied by smug satisfaction from the auction house's elite clientele. Cordelia Fairchild's voice rang out with practiced authority as she called $75,000, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she raised her golden paddle. $80,000, countered Maximilian Westbrook, his voice carrying the casual indifference of someone accustomed to purchasing whatever caught his fancy. Dalton stood motionless near the back of the crowd, his simple paddle remaining lowered, while the price soared beyond his modest means. He'd known this moment would come, the harsh reality of competing against unlimited wealth, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from Thunder's Legacy. The horse had grown increasingly agitated as the bidding progressed, his powerful hooves striking the polished floor in rhythmic patterns that seemed almost like communication. His magnificent head turned repeatedly toward Dalton, as if seeking something the farmer couldn't quite understand. $100,000, called out Beaumont Harrington, a shipping magnate whose collection of prize horses filled 3 private stables. The crowd murmured appreciatively at the 6-figure milestone. Thunder's Legacy suddenly reared up on his hind legs, his front hooves pawing the air as he released a thunderous whinny that echoed throughout the auction hall. The handler struggled to maintain control, pulling firmly on the lead rope while speaking in soothing tones that seemed to have no effect on the increasingly restless stallion. 120,000, Cordelia announced, her voice carrying a note of irritation at the horse's display. Someone needs to control that animal before it hurts someone. The horse's behavior grew more erratic with each passing moment, his eyes wide with what appeared to be distress. He pulled against his restraints, his powerful muscles straining, as he attempted to move toward the crowd. The handler, an experienced horseman named Fletcher, had never encountered such behavior from the typically well-mannered thoroughbred. "Perhaps we should postpone this lot," suggested Pemberton Ashworth, his earlier confidence replaced by concern as Thunder's Legacy's agitation reached alarming levels. "Nonsense," declared Maximilian, raising his paddle with flourish. 150,000. The horse will calm down once he realizes who his new owner is. But Thunder's Legacy had no intention of calming down. Instead, he seemed to grow more determined with each passing second, his powerful frame trembling with barely contained energy. His dark eyes remained fixed on Dalton, and the farmer felt an inexplicable pull toward the magnificent creature. Against his better judgment, Dalton began moving through the crowd, his muddy boots creating a path through the sea of designer shoes and perfectly pressed clothing. The wealthy bidders stepped aside with obvious distaste, making disparaging comments about his presumption in approaching their prize. "Where do you think you're going, farm boy?" sneered Cordelia, her voice sharp with disdain. "This is a private auction, not a petting zoo." But something extraordinary happened as Dalton drew closer to Thunder's Legacy. The horse's frantic behavior began to subside, his ears pricking forward with recognition rather than fear. The powerful stallion stretched his neck toward the farmer, his nostrils flaring as he caught Dalton's scent, a mixture of honest sweat, hay, and the indefinable essence of someone who understood the language of the land. Fletcher, the handler, watched in amazement as the horse's transformation continued. "I've never seen anything like this," he whispered to his assistant. "It's like he knows this man." The crowd fell silent, their mockery replaced by confused curiosity as they witnessed the impossible connection unfolding. Before them, Thunder's Legacy had stopped pulling against his restraints, instead standing perfectly still as Dalton approached, his magnificent head lowered in a gesture that seemed almost like a bow. The auction hall fell into an eerie silence broken only by the soft shuffle of Dalton's boots against the marble floor. Every eye in the room watched as the farmer approached Thunder's Legacy, whose transformation from agitated stallion to calm, expectant creature defied explanation. "This is preposterous," muttered Beaumont Harrington, his gold-rimmed spectacles reflecting the chandelier light. "The horse is simply responding to a familiar scent. Perhaps this man works at the breeding facility." But Fletcher, the experienced handler, knew better. In his 30 years of working with thoroughbreds, he'd never witnessed such an immediate and profound connection between horse and human. Thunder's Legacy's entire demeanor had shifted the moment Dalton entered his sphere of awareness, as if some invisible thread connected them across the crowded auction hall. Dalton stopped just beyond the horse's reach, his weathered hands hanging loosely at his sides. He made no sudden movements, spoke no words, yet Thunder's Legacy responded as if receiving clear communication. The stallion's breathing had steadied, his earlier panic replaced by an almost reverent attention. "Impossible," whispered Cordelia, her voice lacking its earlier confidence. "There must be some trick, some explanation." Pemberton Ashworth stepped forward, his authority asserted through crisp gestures and sharp commands. "Sir, I must ask you to return to your position. You're disrupting the auction process." But before Dalton could respond, Thunder's Legacy made his own statement. The magnificent stallion stepped forward, his movement smooth and deliberate, until his muzzle nearly touched the farmer's outstretched hand. The horse's dark eyes, moments before wild with distress, now held a depth of recognition that sent ripples of astonishment through the watching crowd. "I'll be damned," Fletcher breathed, his professional composure cracking. "In all my years, I've never seen anything like this." Dr. Ophelia Ravenscroft, a veterinarian specializing in equine behavior, pushed through the crowd with scientific curiosity overriding social protocol. Her sharp eyes studied the interaction between man and horse, cataloging details that others might miss. "This is highly unusual," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of expertise. "Horses don't typically form such immediate bonds with strangers. There must be some history here." Dalton's eyes met Dr. Ravenscroft's across the small space separating them from the crowd. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried a weight that silenced the room's murmurs. "There is a history," he said quietly, his gaze returning to Thunder's legacy. "But not the kind you're thinking." The stallion's response was immediate and startling. He pressed his magnificent head against Dalton's chest, a gesture so intimate and trusting that several people in the crowd gasped audibly. The horse's powerful body relaxed completely, as if he'd found exactly what he'd been searching for. "This is ridiculous," Maximilian declared, his voice rising with indignation. "I don't care what parlor tricks this man knows." The bidding was at 150,000, and I intend to complete my purchase. But even as he spoke, Thunder's Legacy's ears pinned back against his head, his earlier calm replaced by focused attention on the steel magnate's son. The horse's body language shifted to one of clear rejection, his message unmistakable to anyone. With eyes to see, Dr. Ravenscroft stepped closer, her scientific training overriding the social dynamics at play. "Mr. Riverstone," Dalton replied, his hand now resting gently on Thunder's Legacy's neck. "Dalton Riverstone. Mr. Riverstone, I must ask, have you had any previous contact with this horse? Any interaction that might explain this behavior?" Dalton's weathered face broke into the first smile he'd shown since entering the auction house. It was a smile that held secrets, understanding, and a deep connection to truths that city folk might never comprehend. "Not with this horse," he said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been wonder. "But with his mother." The revelation hung in the air like morning mist, transforming the auction hall's atmosphere from one of mockery to stunned anticipation. Dr. Ravenscroft's scientific curiosity sparked immediately. While the wealthy bidders exchanged confused glances, their earlier confidence beginning to crack. His mother, Pemberton Ashworth's voice carried a note of skepticism mixed with growing concern. "That's impossible." Thunder's Legacy's dam was Storm's Promise, one of the most closely guarded mares in the breeding industry. No common farmer would have access to such a valuable animal. Dalton's weathered hand continued its gentle stroking along Thunder's Legacy's neck, the horse responding to his touch with an almost human-like contentment. The farmer's eyes held a distant quality, as if he were seeing beyond the present moment into memories that others couldn't access. 7 years ago, Dalton began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to being disbelieved. "I was driving home from the county fair during one of the worst storms in decades. Lightning splitting the sky, rain coming down in sheets that made it impossible to see 10 feet ahead." Thunder's Legacy's ears pricked forward at the sound of his voice, as if the horse understood not just the words, but the emotions behind them. The stallion's breathing had synchronized with Dalton's, creating an almost hypnotic rhythm that held the crowd's attention. "I came around a bend on Highway 47, and there she was, a mare, heavily pregnant, standing in the middle of the road. She was soaked through, shivering, and clearly in distress. Lightning had spooked her from somewhere, and she was lost, afraid, and about to give birth." Cordelia's diamond-studded riding crop tapped impatiently against her designer boots. "This is all very touching, but what does it have to do with Thunder's Legacy?" Storm's Promise was never missing from her stable. Dr. Ravenscroft held up a hand for silence, her trained eye noting details that others missed. "Please continue, Mr. Riverstone." "I couldn't just leave her there," Dalton continued, his voice growing stronger with the telling. "So I coaxed her into my trailer. Took nearly an hour, and that storm man brought her back to my farm. She was in labor before we reached the barn." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, but Thunder's Legacy's response to the story was unmistakable. The stallion's body language spoke of recognition, of some deep memory stirring within his equine consciousness. That's when I realized what I was dealing with, Dalton said, his eyes meeting Dr. Ravenscroft's. This wasn't just any mare. Her conformation, her breeding, everything about her screamed aristocracy. But she was also dying. Fletcher, the handler, stepped closer, his professional interest overriding protocol. Dying how? Complications from the birth. I'm no veterinarian, but I've helped deliver enough foals to know when things go wrong. She was hemorrhaging, weakening with every passing minute, but she fought to stay alive long enough to deliver her colt. The auction hall had grown so quiet that the sound of Thunder's Legacy's breathing seemed amplified. The stallion's dark eyes remained fixed on Dalton's face, as if listening to a story he remembered from some deep, primal part of his being. She died just after sunrise, Dalton continued, his voice growing soft with remembered grief, but not before she made sure her colt was safe, fed, and breathing strong. I stayed with them both through that entire night, helping where I could, being present for what I knew were her final hours. Maximilian Westbrook's face had grown pale beneath his perfectly applied tan. You're claiming you delivered Thunder's Legacy. That's impossible. The breeding records show what they need to show, interrupted Dr. Ravenscroft, her voice sharp with sudden understanding. But horses don't lie, Mr. Westbrook. And this horse is telling us a story that your paperwork can't. Thunder's Legacy suddenly pulled away from Dalton, but not in rejection. Instead, the magnificent stallion positioned himself so that his shoulder pressed against the farmer's chest, his head turning to look directly at the crowd of wealthy bidders. It was a gesture of protection, of choosing sides in a conflict that had suddenly become much more complex than anyone had imagined. What happened to the colt? Dr. Ravenscroft asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. Dalton's smile returned, warmer now, filled with the satisfaction of a truth finally being told. I raised him for 3 months, until the rightful owners tracked him down. They were grateful, of course, but they needed him back for their breeding program. I understood. I never expected to see him again. The implications of his words settled over the crowd like a heavy blanket, transforming their understanding of everything. They thought they knew about the evening's events. The auction hall's pristine atmosphere had transformed into something electric, charged with possibilities that none of the wealthy bidders had anticipated. When they'd arrived for what they assumed would be a routine acquisition, Thunder's Legacy stood pressed against Dalton's side, his magnificent form creating a living testament to bonds that transcended money and social status. Dr. Ravenscroft pulled out her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen as she accessed breeding databases and veterinary records. Her professional composure cracked slightly as she uncovered information that painted a picture far different from the evening's initial narrative. The timeline matches, she announced, her voice carrying the authority of scientific verification. Storm's Promise was reported missing for exactly 18 hours during a severe thunderstorm 7 years ago. The official report stated she was found in her stall the following morning, apparently having given birth during the night. Pemberton Ashworth's face had grown ashen, his carefully maintained composure beginning to fracture. That's impossible. The documentation clearly shows. The documentation shows what powerful people wanted it to show. Dr. Ravenscroft interrupted, her professional ethics overriding social protocol. But the truth has a way of surfacing, especially when it's standing right in front of us. Thunder's Legacy seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. The stallion lifted his magnificent head, his dark eyes surveying the crowd with an intelligence that spoke of memories deeper than human documentation. His gaze settled on each of the wealthy bidders in turn, his message clear and unmistakable. Recognition had been earned, not purchased. Cordelia Fairchild's diamond bracelet caught the light as she gestured dismissively. This is all very entertaining, but it doesn't change the fact that Thunder's Legacy is here to be sold. Whatever sentimental connection this farmer claims to have is irrelevant to the business at hand. But even as she spoke, Thunder's Legacy demonstrated just how relevant his connection to Dalton truly was. The stallion turned his back to the crowd, positioning himself as a barrier between the farmer and the assembled bidders. His body language, spoke of protection, of loyalty that couldn't be bought or sold. Fletcher, the experienced handler, had witnessed enough unusual behavior to recognize something extraordinary when he saw it. In 30 years of working with thoroughbreds, he said quietly, "I've never seen a horse choose his owner so definitively. This goes beyond training, beyond conditioning. This is recognition at a level most people never experience." Maximilian Westbrook's face had flushed red with indignation. "I don't care what mystical nonsense you people are spouting. I came here to purchase a horse, and I intend to complete that transaction. The bidding stands at $150,000. But Dr. Ravenscroft had discovered something in her research that changed everything. Her voice carried the weight of legal authority as she addressed the crowd. "According to the veterinary records I'm accessing, Storm's promise was never officially confirmed as Thunder's Legacy's dam through DNA testing. The parentage was assumed based on circumstances, but never scientifically verified." The implications of her words rippled through the crowd like stones dropped in still water. Dalton's weathered hand found Thunder's Legacy's neck again, and the horse's response was immediate and profound, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to come from the very center of his being. "What are you suggesting?" Pemberton Ashworth's voice had lost its earlier confidence. "I'm suggesting that legal ownership of Thunder's Legacy may not be as clear-cut as everyone assumed." Dr. Ravenscroft replied, "If this horse was born on Mr. Riverstone's property, delivered by his hands and raised by his care, then the legal questions become much more complex." Thunder's Legacy chose that moment to make his own statement. The magnificent stallion stepped forward, his movement fluid and purposeful, until he stood directly in front of Dalton. Then, in a gesture that silenced every voice in the room, he lowered his proud head and gently pressed his forehead against the farmer's chest. It was an act of submission, of recognition, of choosing that transcended anything that money could purchase. The horse's message was clear to everyone present. His loyalty belonged to the man who had helped bring him into the world, not to whoever could afford his price. The wealthy bidders stood frozen, their paddles lowered as they witnessed something that their money couldn't buy, their status couldn't command, and their arrogance couldn't comprehend. They were seeing love in its purest form, the bond between a creature and the human who had been present for his first breath. The auction hall had been transformed from a place of commerce into something resembling a courtroom, with Thunder's Legacy serving as both witness and evidence in a case that transcended monetary value. The horse remained pressed against Dalton's side, his magnificent form creating a living declaration of loyalty that no amount of money could purchase. Dr. Ravenscroft closed her tablet with decisive authority, based on the evidence presented and the horse's clear behavioral indicators. "I'm recommending that this auction be suspended pending a full investigation into Thunder's Legacy's true parentage and legal ownership." Pemberton Ashworth's pristine composure had completely crumbled. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he realized the legal implications of selling a horse whose ownership was now in question. "This is highly irregular. The consignment papers clearly state. The consignment papers state what someone wanted them to state," interrupted a new voice from the back of the room. Judge Cordelia Brennan, a respected equine law specialist who had been attending the auction as a potential bidder, stepped forward with the authority of someone accustomed to untangling complex legal situations. "I've been observing this situation with great interest," Judge Brennan continued, her voice carrying the weight of legal expertise. "What we're witnessing here is a classic case of equine recognition that supersedes human documentation. The horse has made his choice, and in cases involving animals of this caliber, that choice carries significant legal weight." Thunder's Legacy seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. The stallion lifted his magnificent head and released a sound that was part whinny, part rumble, and entirely victorious. His dark eyes met those of each wealthy bidder in turn, his message clear and unmistakable. Maximilian Westbrook made one final attempt to salvage his intended purchase. "This is ridiculous. I don't care what the horse wants. I came here to buy him, and I'm prepared to pay whatever price is necessary." But Thunder's Legacy had his own response to that declaration. The stallion stepped sideways, placing himself directly between Maximilian and Dalton. his body language speaking of protection that went beyond mere preference. His ears pinned back against his head, and his powerful muscles tensed as if preparing to defend his chosen human. That settles it, Judge Brennan announced with finality. In cases involving disputed ownership of intelligent animals, the creature's clear preference is considered primary evidence. Combined with Mr. Riverstone's testimony about the circumstances of this horse's birth, I'm ruling that the sale cannot proceed until proper DNA testing is completed. Fletcher, the handler, had been quietly observing the entire interaction with professional fascination. "Your Honor, if I may," he said, his voice carrying the respect of someone who understood the gravity of the situation. "In my 30 years of working with thoroughbreds, I've never seen a horse demonstrate such clear, unambiguous preference for a specific human. This goes beyond training, beyond conditioning. This is recognition at the most fundamental level. Dr. Ravenscroft nodded her professional agreement. The behavioral evidence is overwhelming. This horse knows Mr. Riverstone, trusts him, and has chosen him as his primary human bond. That kind of connection cannot be fabricated or purchased." The wealthy bidders stood in stunned silence, their paddles hanging uselessly at their sides. They had come to the auction expecting to compete with money, but they had encountered something that their wealth couldn't touch: genuine love, loyalty, and recognition that transcended social status. Dalton's weathered hand found Thunder's Legacy's neck, and the horse's response was immediate and profound. The stallion's breathing synchronized with his chosen human's, creating a rhythm that spoke of connection deeper than words. "What happens now?" Cordelia Fairchild asked, her earlier arrogance replaced by genuine curiosity. Judge Brennan's smile held the satisfaction of justice properly served. "Now, Mr. Riverstone, you have the option to claim legal ownership of Thunder's legacy, pending DNA verification of your story. Given the circumstances and the horse's clear preference, I believe any court would rule in your favor." Thunder's legacy seemed to understand that his future had been decided. The magnificent stallion turned his head toward Dalton, his dark eyes holding a depth of gratitude that transcended species. Then, in a gesture that brought tears to several onlookers' eyes, he gently nuzzled the farmer's weathered cheek. "Well," Dalton said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, "I guess we're going home, boy." The horse's response was immediate and joyous, a sound that was part celebration, part relief, and entirely victorious. Thunder's legacy had chosen his human, and his human had chosen him back. As they walked toward the exit, the crowd parted, respectfully, their earlier mockery replaced by something approaching awe. They had witnessed something rare and beautiful: the triumph of genuine connection over material wealth, of loyalty over luxury, of love over money. The dirty boots that had once been a source of ridicule now carried their owner and his chosen companion toward a future built on mutual respect, understanding, and the kind of bond that no amount of money could ever purchase. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the air clean and fresh with possibility. Thunder's legacy stepped into his new life with the confidence of a or who had found his true home, while Dalton smiled with the satisfaction of a man who had discovered that sometimes the most valuable things in life choose you.